For more on the conference, let's go to Michael Dorsey. He's the Chair and Director of Rob and Melanie Walton Sustainability Solutions Services. He's also a Professor of Practice at the College of Global Futures. Thanks so much for your time there, Michael.
Thank you.
We just got a little bit of a wrap there from Montreal. What do you think is at stake at COP15?
Really what's at stake is the planet's biodiversity, the life systems of this planet. We've got to commit vastly more resources than are being negotiated right now. The conversations in Montreal are in the billions of dollars when we really need not just hundreds of billions, but really trillions of dollars per year to get out ahead of this problem. And that's the amount of capital that we've got to inject into the multilateral system if we're actually going to even get close to a 30% protection of biodiversity by 2030. And indeed, if we fall less than those amounts, we're going to fall way short of that mark.
Scientists say the biodiversity crisis presents a longer-term threat to the viability of the human species. It feels quite alarming. How alarmed should people be? Is the threat comparable in significance to the climate crisis, do you think?
These are joined threats. The climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are bound up together, unfortunately. They're inextricably linked. And this is not a long-term threat in terms of biodiversity. The fact is that over the past generation, we've lost, depending on what kinds of species and what regions of the world, north of 60–70% of certain species. So the threat to biodiversity is one that's real, it's one that's present, it's one that's everyday, and actually it's made worse by the unfolding climate crisis that's gripping the planet as we speak.
There is an argument in the Global South that the plan to turn 30% of the Earth into protected areas is unscientific and a racist logic, that it comes from a mainstream approach to conservation that's based on fortress conservatism, a model imposed in Africa and Asia during colonial times. Can you shed any light on where this argument comes from and how perhaps combining biodiversity with the needs of the local people is essential in moving forward?
Well, biodiversity is inextricably linked to climate just as much as the protection of biodiversity is inextricably linked to those that are closest to it, those that live with it, those that are living in forests and so forth. I wouldn't go as far as saying that the desire to protect 30% of biodiversity by 2030 is rooted in racist logics. I think there is a huge scientific basis for that. And actually the scientific basis points us to the need to protect vastly more biodiversity, not necessarily locking it away in protected areas where people don't have access, but making access for those folks that are already living in wild places, living in nature, working with nature, and have been doing so for millennia. So really we've got to open up a conversation about how we can protect biodiversity and protect the indigenous rights of people that have been living with that very same biodiversity.
Countries that are poorer economically but rich in biodiversity argue that that they need help from wealthier countries if they're going to conserve their biodiversity. What agreements might be possible to help support poorer nations, do you think?
Well, look, they're absolutely right. The poorest of the poor, the world's poor countries in the global south, as it were, they need vastly more resources than are being negotiated in Montreal. The conversation in Montreal is, making commitments in the billions of dollars. Earlier this year at the United Nations General Assembly, the German government made a commitment of about $1.5 billion. That's almost 1,000 times short of the targets that are needed to really get out ahead of this problem. So vastly more resources are needed to support the poor countries of the world, and really ultimately not just to protect biodiversity and wild places and spaces, but to protect those people that are living on the front lines of the destruction of biodiversity as well.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Michael Dorsey there for us.